Hi, I'm Nick Parsons with Hasty-Bake, and today we're talking about Fire Management 101. Whether you've had a grill for a long time or you're a brand new grill owner, managing your fire, getting good clean airflow, making sure you're using the appropriate and quality charcoal is going to be the key to making sure that you're cooking the best food possible on your Hasty-Bake. So we're going to roll through some basics of fire management today. Hopefully by the time we're all done, you'll have a lot better understanding of how to burn a clean, efficient fire in your Hasty-Bake and get the best food possible. First thing we're talking about is airflow. Airflow is absolutely essential when you're cooking on your Hasty-Bake. When you have bad airflow, you have a smoldering fire, you get bitter smoke, you get puffy white smoke, it turns your meat gray. It's not a good situation and you don't want to be dealing with it. So the key, number one, with fire management is making sure you have adequate airflow. You always want to make sure your vents are open. You never close the vents off completely because your fire needs air. The three things that fire needs are oxygen, heat, and a fuel source. So as we're going through this, oxygen is number one. We always make sure that the vents down here and on this side of the grill are open. Now, depending on if we're smoking or grilling or how long we're going to be cooking, those vent positions may change, and we'll cover that today. The other thing we want to make sure with airflow is that you're using quality charcoal, you're using quality hardwood for your smoking wood. You don't want to be using the cheapest thing on the shelf. You don't want to be using something that's been exposed to the elements or is old or damp or anything like that. You want good, clean, quality, dry charcoal, dry hardwood that's going to burn incredibly efficiently. The other thing you want to make sure, and as you know, one of the benefits of Hasty-Bake is you have the adjustable firebox. When you're lighting your initial fire, you want to make sure that there's enough room on the height of your firebox so that air can come in through the vent and breeze across the bottom of your fire. If your firebox is located too low, you're not going to be able to get air into your fire, and your fire is going to smolder and create bitter smoke, and you'll probably have a hard time getting the temperature up too. The next thing we're going to talk about is vent adjustments. Every Hasty-Bake is equipped with an intake vent and an exhaust vent located in different positions based on your model. Your intake vent controls the amount of oxygen that gets into your fire, thus the temperature of the fire as it rises. Your exhaust vent controls the speed of the air and the smoke as it exits the chamber and directly relates to the temperature bringing down. If you want to increase the temperature of your fire, you're going to start in 1/4 to 1/2 inch intervals and open up the exhaust vent on the intake side. That will ingest a lot of air into the firebox and cause that temperature to rise. If you want to lower the temperature, the first place to start is the exhaust vent, as by closing that vent down in 1/4 to 1/2 inch intervals, you slow the draw, you slow the amount of air speed that is rotating in your chamber, and it directly relates to the temperature of the fire. You can also control heat temperature by lowering and closing the exhaust vent, but you never want to close it all the way because a closed exhaust vent is not allowing oxygen to get into your fire, and as we talked about earlier, that will cause a slow burning, smoldering, dirty fire, and you want to keep a well-breathing fire to make sure that you're getting the best quality product off your Hasty-Bake. The next thing we want to talk about is how much charcoal to add in your firebox. Now this varies based on whether you're grilling hot and fast or you're smoking low and slow. Some people add too much and they end up either having too hot of a fire or wasting charcoal, or they don't add enough and they're constantly feeding their fire. We want to start off with a good medium amount of charcoal, which in my mind is about half the width of your firebox, about the height of the firebox. Firebox sits about 3 inches off, so you got a 3-inch base of coal halfway across is a good place to start. If you're smoking, and we'll talk about a little bit later on, that's the width of also your heat shield. So that way your charcoal doesn't extend past the heat shield and burn your meat. If you're grilling, you can spread that out a little bit, but the idea is doing about half the firebox width as high as it goes. As we talk about building our fire a little bit later, we'll talk about making sure that we're using the appropriately sized charcoal. But one thing you want to know when you're building a charcoal bed in your firebox is when you have a lot of charcoal powder, the powder that breaks down from charcoal as it gets smaller, it gets thrown around in the back of a warehouse, that powder builds up, it can actually snuff out your fire. So one thing we want to do after we dump the charcoal in and kind of concise it up to half the box is when it's inside the rack, I like to give it a little shake and get the rest of the charcoal dust distributed down into the ash pan. It actually is beneficial, as we'll talk about later, having a layer of charcoal dust on the bottom of that ash pan, but it also allows room for air to flow through your charcoal and not get snuffed out by powder. The last couple things we want to talk about when it comes to direct airflow is the type of model that you have. When it comes to gourmet and continental models, you have to realize that the hood has a bifold lid, which has a lot larger opening than the opening on a Legacy. So you're going to naturally get more airflow into that hood. You may have to compensate by that by dropping your vents a little bit more than you would on a Legacy model. It's not a flaw, it's nothing wrong with it, it's just the way that the grill works. When it comes to a Legacy model, you have to be aware that when you open that hood, you're now injecting tons and tons of oxygen down into your fire that you're not injecting when you're on a gourmet or a continental model because it has solid walls. So you have to be aware that your fire can jump pretty substantial in temperature the longer you leave that open, and you may have to compensate with your vents. It's just the nature of cooking with charcoal. Now, one warning we always want to make sure we give you is that when it comes to charcoal cooking, more oxygen equals more heat. Unlike a gas grill where all the heat comes from a gas burner and the heat never changes until you turn the knob, the hotter charcoal gets, the bigger charcoal gets, the more oxygen gets put into the fire, the larger the fire gets, and it can get dangerous. So never walk away from a charcoal grill, never leave it unattended. If you're grilling with a lid open, make sure you're paying attention to the size of the fire. You can use our lift mechanism to raise, lower that fire as necessary to not only change the temperature that your meat is getting, but also to drop the fire down if it starts to get a little large. But please be aware that when you leave that lid open and you're cooking with charcoal, you have the chance for a grease fire to start if you're not paying attention. So never leave it unattended. That's just the nature of charcoal grilling. Next thing we're going to talk about is lighting your fire. You want to make sure, as we talked about, that you have the appropriate amount of charcoal in your firebox for whatever you're cooking. So if you're cooking an 8 to 10 hour pork butt or a brisket, you want to have more charcoal in so you're not having to constantly feed your fire. For something like hot dogs and steaks and burgers, you're going to use less because it's a lot faster cook, and you don't want to add a bunch of extra charcoal that's just going to be a waste. So add the appropriate amount of charcoal, making sure that you're keeping two-zone cooking, so one side hot, one side empty of charcoal, so you have a place to move your protein if it starts to get too warm. And you're going to take whatever your preferred lighting method is. We like to use Hasty-Bake Fire Starter Gel. It's alcohol and ethanol. It burns really clean. It doesn't leave any scent or any taste on your food. You can also use the Weber wax paraffin cubes, strike fire matches. You can even use a charcoal chimney. Now, for the options where you light, unlike a charcoal chimney, you're going to put the wax or the gel or the match on your ash pan directly underneath your firebox. Raise your firebox up about 3 inches to ensure that flames can lap up at the charcoal and that oxygen can adequately spread that heat around. Put it on the ash pan, slide it in underneath your charcoal, make sure your lid is open, and make sure your vents are open. If you light it with the lid closed, you're not allowing enough oxygen in. It's going to take forever for your fire to light, if it even lights at all. Now, when you're using a charcoal chimney, you can start that on top of the grates, or you can pull your ash pan and your firebox out and start it down in your firebox. One thing to be aware of when you're lighting a charcoal chimney, though, is that you're lighting a lot more coal in a charcoal chimney at one time than you are when you're using an option like this. That's great for hot and fast grilling, but when you're doing something low and slow like smoking, you don't want that much coal lit, so you may back off to maybe a quarter or a half a chimney rather than using the entire thing, or you're going to be fighting temperatures the entire time you're smoking. For more options of how to light your grill and different methods to light it, you can reference our videos on Hasty-Bake.com. The last thing I want to talk about when it comes to lighting your grill is which side to light your grill. We get this question a lot. If you're grilling something hot and fast, like steaks or burgers or hot dogs, you want to inject as much oxygen at one time into that fire as you can because you want to get grilling really quick. When you're doing something lower and slower, you want to make sure you're building up that fire real slow so that you don't get out of hand. So we light on different sides based on what we're cooking. When we're doing a hot and fast grill where you're going to be in the bake or the sear position with no heat shield, you want to light on the side of the firebox that's closest to the door. The door allows the most amount of oxygen into your fire. It also allows the most amount of oxygen through the vent and directly injects into your charcoal, and it'll heat up a lot quicker. As always, make sure when you're lighting, you're leaving your lid open, and you'll get a nice hot bed of coals in no time. Now, when it comes to smoking, you want to do the opposite. You want to light on the opposite side of the door and allow that fire to burn toward the door. And here's the reason. When oxygen is behind fire and blowing on fire, it encourages that fire to burn faster and faster and hotter. That's not what we want when we're smoking. So by lighting the fire on the opposite side of the door, you're causing that fire to reach out and try to move itself toward the oxygen, which is a lot slower process than having the oxygen blow the fire from the back and eat up all the coal. So when I'm lighting for smoking, I fill my firebox, and I normally light one corner or the other corner. You can even light the middle, but light on the opposite side of the door to make that fire move as slow as possible. Last thing when we're lighting the fire, when is it done? Great question, and here's what it is. We normally like to see about 2 fistfuls of charcoal being fully lit when you want to smoke on your Hasty-Bake. Any more than that, and you may fight temperatures the entire time. Any less than that, and your temperatures are going to be too low. So make sure with your lid open when you're lighting, you have at least 2 fistful sizes of charcoal that are burning before you shut your lid down and adjust your vents. Next thing we're going to talk about is vent adjustments. Every Hasty-Bake is equipped with an intake vent and an exhaust vent located in different positions based on your model. Your intake vent controls the amount of oxygen that gets into your fire, thus the temperature of the fire as it rises. Your exhaust vent controls the speed of the air and the smoke as it exits the chamber and directly relates to the temperature bringing down. If you want to increase the temperature of your fire, you're going to start in 1/4 to 1/2 inch intervals and open up the exhaust vent on the intake side. That will ingest a lot of air into the firebox and cause that temperature to rise. If you want to lower the temperature, the first place to start is the exhaust vent, as by closing that vent down in 1/4 to 1/2 inch intervals, you slow the draw, you slow the amount of air speed that is rotating in your chamber, and it directly relates to the temperature of the fire. You can also control heat temperature by lowering and closing the exhaust vent, but you never want to close it all the way, because a closed exhaust vent is not allowing oxygen to get into your fire, and as we talked about earlier, that will cause a slow burning, smoldering, dirty fire, and you want to keep a well-breathing fire to make sure that you're getting the best quality product off your Hasty-Bake. Next, we're talking about firebox positioning. As you know, one of the major benefits to a Hasty-Bake is you have an adjustable firebox that can go from 18 inches below your grate all the way up to about 2 inches below your meat. It makes the grill extremely versatile, and it's one of the best features of having a Hasty-Bake. What that allows us to do is cook in many different positions depending on the protein that we're using. The first thing we're talking about is a sear. A sear is very basic. It's getting the fire as close to your meat as possible with direct heat to try to impact and form a really nice crust or bark on the meat that you're using. So for the sear, you move your indicator knob all the way up to the sear position. You make sure that there's no heat shield on top of your firebox. And depending on the amount of protein that's on your grill, you can spread your coals out to try to maximize the amount of air that's coming into your grill. Now, you also, in preparation for a sear, you want to leave your lid open for a couple minutes to ingest as much oxygen as possible. And you may even want to crack your vents wide open just to get that grill as hot as you can get. Once that's done, you put your position in the sear and you put your protein on top of the fire, and it goes to work doing its thing. A Hasty-Bake becomes a true indirect cooker when you start employing the use of the heat shield. The heat shield, which is included in every adjustable model of a Hasty-Bake, is a wonderful tool to make sure that you can get true offset indirect cooking inside your model. The heat shield goes directly on top of the firebox and allows you to cook traditional smoked barbecue without the impact of having direct heat hit the bottom of your meat. To do that, you drop your firebox into the smoke position at the very bottom, making sure that you have enough oxygen between the ash pan and the firebox for air to be able to get in and keep your fire burning. And then you insert the heat shield on top to completely cover your coals. This allows the heat and the smoke to exit the side of the heat shield and come up and begin circulation in your firebox. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about smoking later, but I want to make sure we realize that as the heat is exiting the side of your heat shield, it is coming in direct contact with whatever is on the opposite side of your firebox. So if you're smoking something, you want to make sure you position it over the top of your heat shield, because if it's to the left of the heat shield, you're directly injecting heat right onto the bottom of your meat. The next thing I want to talk about is hot smoking. So the idea of hot smoking is that you're smoking at a higher temperature than you would if you were cooking in the 250 to 270 range, but you're still getting the benefits of having a separation between your fire and the meat. In order to hot smoke, we still keep the firebox in the smoke position, but we go ahead and we remove the heat shield, allowing full use of that 18 inches from the bottom of the firebox to the bottom of your grate. This is great for roasting chickens and pork loins, where you want to build a little bit better bark or crust on the outside, but you don't want to cook so low that sometimes that skin turns a little bit gummy or it tends to dry out on leaner proteins. The last firebox position we're talking about is the bake position. It's extremely versatile, although it confuses some people about how best to use it. The bake position turns your Hasty-Bake truly into a charcoal-fired oven, which is wonderful to bake things in the 300 to 400 degree range and get the full benefits of what you would use on an inside range on your Hasty-Bake. The most versatile position for bake is by putting your firebox shield back on top of your firebox. This allows a nice even surface for that heat to rise. You can even build your fire in the middle of the firebox if you'd like and put the heat shield on it to allow the heat to come up both sides. But what this allows is you can still roast chickens and everything else you can do in that 350-ish range, but you're getting the benefits of having some kind of diffusion rather than having heat directly impact the meat that's right above it. You can also use this to cook things like brownies and cookies and breads, things that need to be in that baking range that may benefit from the flavor of charcoal and hardwood that you would traditionally do inside. Now we can do them outside on the grill and get a whole new level of flavor. We're going to move on to talking about different methods of building your fire and smoking and grilling. Right now we're talking about building your fire for a hot and fast grill. This is going to be something that's going to benefit on lean proteins, on things like steaks and burgers and dogs and even pork chops, where you want to have a good hot coal bed underneath that's not indirect. So you remove your heat shield and you go directly into your firebox. You want to spread your coals out evenly to allow as most oxygen as possible to get up into your charcoal. So go ahead and spread them out, creating two zones like we always talk about, because on charcoal you don't have a knob to control your heat. So you spread about halfway, maybe a little bit more, out of your firebox, and you move that down into the smoke position to light your grill. Put your fire gel or your cubes or whatever your preferred method of lighting is down in the ash pan, slide it under, and allow the grill to go ahead and heat up. Again, always light with the lid open to allow the most amount of oxygen to get into your fire. Once your charcoal is lit and the fire's kind of gone down in the ash pan but your charcoal is burning, go ahead and raise your firebox up to between the smoke and the bake position, somewhere in the range of about 14 inches below your grate. That's kind of the average when you're doing hot and fast grilling. Make sure it's in the correct position, your doors are closed, and your vents are open. For hot and fast, you can open your vents all the way. Now go ahead and put your protein on, making sure you realize where your zones are, so if something starts to get a little burned or a little too hot, you can move it off to the cooler side. You can also use the main benefit of the Hasty-Bake, the indicator, to move your firebox lower down from bake, maybe even into the smoke position to do a little bit of hot smoking in order to get that fire separated from your meat if you built a little bit too big of a fire. That way you don't end up burning the proteins that you're cooking. When you're all done with your grill, take the protein off, clean it as always. You can lower your firebox all the way down until it touches the bottom of your ash pan. If you have a good bed of ash from a couple previous cooks, that'll snuff out the rest of your fire and allow a reserve of charcoal for the next time you start grilling. If you like traditional barbecue, setting up your grill for low and slow smoking is going to be the ticket for you. We're going to start out with our firebox. We're going to add the appropriate amount of charcoal. Now what we like to do for smoking is we add a little extra charcoal than you would for grilling because you don't want to constantly be feeding that fire. You also want to mix in something like hardwood chunks. Wood types, which we'll talk about in a little bit, vary based on the flavor profile you want and the style of cooking you're doing. But what we typically like to do is this. We just start off with a good lump-based charcoal. You can use briquettes, we just prefer lump. You can fill your firebox about a third of the height, so one layer about 3/4 of the way through the firebox. Then what I like to do is come back with your wood chunks and I distribute them evenly, probably 5 or 6 or even 8 if you like some extra smoke, around the top of that charcoal. I then come back with a bag of charcoal and I add more on top of that and then disperse a couple more extra wood chunks through. What that allows is as the fire burns and makes its way through your charcoal, it continually has one piece of wood and another to hit so that you ensure that you're getting smoke the entirety of your cook. You can build your charcoal base as high as you want to go, and you really can get about 5 or 6 inches off the top of your firebox by the time you're all done building the fire. Once you're done constructing your charcoal, getting your wood in there, go ahead and place the ash pan on top. Start off your fire in the smoke position with your preferred lighting method and light on the inside away from the door to allow that slow smoke burn. You want to see 2 fistfuls sizes of charcoal burning, no more than that or you're going to be up into the 300 plus range. And once those are burning, go ahead and close your lid and balance out your vents, ensuring that you're burning a good clean fire, which means making sure your exhaust vent is partially open and your intake vent is a lot more open to get that good oxygen flowing. After about 10 minutes of having your lid open, you close it down, you should start to see your grill level in the 225 to 275 range depending on your preference. If you need a little bit more temperature than you're gaining, you can crack that lid open for a minute or two and come back and close it again, and it will inject just enough more air to raise your temperature that extra 25 or 35 or 40 degrees that you may need for your smoking. Now, after 15 or 20 minutes, your fire should level off and you should have a good idea of how it wants to burn. You can adjust your vents from there to raise or lower based on the kind of protein that you want to cook. Let's talk about smoking wood and grilling wood. Wood is essential in getting the best flavor possible out of your Hasty-Bake. Now, you can smoke with straight lump charcoal and you'll get a good smoke profile, but being able to tailor it with the type of wood that you use is going to take your cooking to the next level. So it's very easy to go online and find some basic recommendations on what kind of wood to use with what kind of protein. I'm just going to breeze through them real quick. Something heavy like a mesquite is really good for grilling. It cooks really hot, it cooks really fast, it puts off a great flavor, but it can get over smoked. So when you grill with something like that, you're doing a short amount of time that your protein is going to be on the fire, and mesquite works really well for that. Now, when you move into your oaks and your hickories, the hardwoods that you're smoking with, they're a lot heavier, a lot smoky flavor, and they can overpower light stuff like chicken and fish. So you want to save stuff like oak and hickory for things like beef and pork that are going to be a little bit heavier and be able to absorb that smoke and not get overpowered. When you move down into your medium woods like a pecan, it's a very mild flavor, it's a very sweet flavor. It's good on literally almost everything. Beef, pork, chicken, fish, doesn't matter. When you go back over to your fruit woods, they are great to add to additional woods to be able to get a little bit more pop of flavor, sometimes even a little bit more pop of color. Be cautious when you add fruit wood though, because you can over smoke something with fruit wood very easily. So I don't like to use it on its own. I like to pair it. I'll throw some pecan and I'll put a little bit of fruit wood in it. Even cherry wood adds some wonderful color to chicken and pork. So feel free to experiment with those different kinds of wood. Now, when you're building your fire and adding wood, you can disperse wood chunks throughout your charcoal so that as that charcoal burns, you continually hit a wood chunk throughout the course of your cooking. We prefer to use wood chunks over wood chips because wood chunks actually burn for a long enough time that you get smoke continually rather than a short burst. Wood chips are a lot more beneficial when you're grilling and you just want to get a couple minutes of quick smoke on them, and then they're going to go ahead and go away. Now, the question that comes up a lot is, do you soak your wood? Do you soak your wood chips? And the scientific answer is no. There's been a lot of tests, there's been a lot of experimentation on whether soaking wood makes a difference in a cook time or a smoke time, and the answer is unequivocally no. When you soak your wood, first of all, wood chips will get logged down, but wood chunks don't actually absorb a lot of wood, or a lot of water. So when you soak it, you're only getting a little bit of water in that wood. When you throw that on your hot fire, the smoke that comes up is not actually smoke, it's steam. And in order to get flavor, you want it to be real smoke. So when you put wood chunks or wood chips that have been soaked on your fire, that steam has to burn off before it actually generates smoke, which adds flavor. By the time the steam burns off, you now have dry wood that you could have just put on your fire from the beginning. So don't bother soaking your wood chunks, don't bother soaking your wood chips. It does not make a difference. It may make the chips last a little bit longer, but you're not getting the benefit of the flavor. Use a good, solid, quality wood chunk when you're smoking, and you're going to get a wonderful flavor difference that you wouldn't get when you're just using charcoal on its own. We're going to talk about keeping your grill clean. I know it sounds a little funny for fire management, but the potential for your grill to have a grease fire when it's dirty directly relates to managing your fire. You can't manage a grease fire, so let's work on keeping our grill clean. A lot of people believe that when you cook continually on a grill, the grease and the smoke seasons the inside of the grill, and it does. But you have to be careful, because if you get too much accumulation on that grill, you're now prime territory for a grease fire. So what we always want to do is make sure before and after our cooks, we scrape down our grates with a good quality grill brush. Don't buy a cheap grill brush. The bristles can fall out, they can get stuck in your meat, you'll end up in the hospital, it's not worth it. Buy a good quality grill brush that has capture bristles that are not going to fall out, or use a wood brush that is only a plank of wood, or sponges or something like that that's going to contain all of the material inside the brush rather than let it loose. Clean your grills before you cook. Clean your grills after you cook. Make sure your grates are clean. This is especially important when you're searing, because as you bring that fire up to your grate level to get that really, really hot sear, the first thing that's going to catch on fire is any old material that is on top of your grates, and that fire that burns on top of your grates can directly transfer to your hood and start a grease fire, and that's a nightmare to deal with. The other thing you want to make sure is that the runners and the slots on the side of walls of the grill maintain complete clarity to be able to slide everything in and out, that your grease doesn't build up, that you don't get charcoal built up on it. So a couple times a month, go ahead and take your grills out, take a good grill brush or a spatula or even a drywall scraper, and come alongside and just scrape the runners on the top side of the grill underneath the grates, scrape the channeling where your firebox slides in and out, make sure there's nothing built up there. That's so close to the flame, it's really easy for that to go ahead and start a grease fire. Also, about once or twice a year, I like to do a really good deep clean on my grill. I come in with a grill brush, I knock down any creosote or anything that's loose hanging on the inside because you don't want it to fall down on your meat. I take the grates out, I open the door, I take the firebox and the ash pan out, and I scrape the inside of anything that's built up. A lot of times you can hose it out or even do a real light pressure wash. Make sure it's not too strong because you can remove the powder coat. But you can wash it off and make sure you dry it completely. You don't want any water left in that grill because water and heat and ash make lye, it makes rust, it'll rust out the inside of your grill. But if you do hose it out, come in there with a good rag, dry the whole thing out, leave it open in the sun and let all that water evaporate, and you're gonna have a nice clean grill. As long as you don't do it too hard, you're not gonna lose the seasoning, but what you do lose is the ability to start a grease fire, which is the worst possible nightmare you can have when you're trying to manage a good clean fire. I got a couple quick tips for you. This is not part of our troubleshooting, we'll hit that in a minute. But a couple quick tips that are really going to help you raise your fire or lower your fire temperature in kind of an emergency. So if you're having a hard time keeping your fire temperature up, say it's around 200, 220 degrees and you really want it at 250, you adjust the airflow in your vents, your intake and your exhaust, and it doesn't quite get you where you want to go, chances are it's some kind of environmental impact. So it's going to be humidity or temperature or wind or even rain is what's keeping that fire down. So the trick we like to use is what we call the turbo method. You take a small rock or a wood chip or even a spatula and you insert it in the side of your grill and just crack that lid about 1/8 of an inch. You don't need any more than that. You're collectively adding enough oxygen around the 1/8 of an inch on that hood that you're getting more air down in, and by adding that turbo method, you're going to go ahead and raise up your fire degree probably 25 to 50 degrees within just a few minutes. You can leave that turbo in the whole time if it just will not want to climb anymore, or you can pull it out once you get to your temperature that you really want. But it's a great tool to kind of keep in your tool belt to use when you need to get that fire up and going, or you need to get ready for a sear and you just want to do it a little bit quicker. The other tool is using your ash pan. Now, we like to keep our grills as clean as possible, but we do recommend 3 to 5 worth of cook ash down in the bottom of our ash pan. And the reason why is this: as grease drips down, the ash catches that grease and engulfs it and keeps it from splashing up and causing a grease fire. So you keep a cleaner grill by having some ash in the bottom of the pan. The other key is when your grill starts to run away from you, if you want to be in the 275 range and it goes up over 325 or 350, and closing the vents down and lowering the firebox a little bit doesn't quite get you where you want to be, you can crank that firebox all the way down and bury it down into your bed of ash, and it's going to go ahead and drop your temperature within a few minutes, probably 25 to 50 degrees. Now, you can't smoke like that all day. It would smolder and it wouldn't be a very clean fire. But in an emergency, when you really need to get that temperature down, having that 1 or 2 inches of a bed of ash in the bottom that you can dump your firebox into is going to make all the difference. Just make sure that if you keep your grill outside and you keep ash in it, you keep it covered, because water and ash creates lye, and that creates rust, and you can rust out the bottom of your grill. So make sure you bring your grill under cover, you keep it covered with some kind of a material cover over the top if you're going to do that. But by having that turbo method and having that bed of ash ready, you can get your grill as hot as you need it to or as cold as you need to a lot quicker than if you were just doing it with the vents on its own. Lastly, I want to go through some quick troubleshooting tips for some common questions we get on how to resolve some issues you may be experiencing when you're cooking. The first is your fire is not getting hot enough. Chances are you're not getting enough oxygen into it. Remember that fire needs oxygen, fuel, and heat to be able to burn. If your fire is not getting hot enough, you probably don't have enough air in it. Number one reason is people are lighting their grill without leaving the lid open. That's essential, is making sure you get enough oxygen from the top into your charcoal to get that to light. You're also probably shutting the lid before you have enough coals get lit. Oftentimes when someone says, I just can't get my grill up over 200 or 225 degrees, you're not letting those 2 fistfuls of charcoal get lit before you shut your grill down and try to level everything out. Lastly, you could have too dense of a coal bed. What this normally means is as you've dumped your charcoal, you've got a lot of that charcoal powder built up in the bottom of your firebox. So simply give your firebox a little shake and let that powder fall down into the ash pan and then light your fire. With a good pair of welding gloves, you can even do that when your fire is burning. Grab the charcoal pan and give it a little shake, get that dense ash dust falling down into your ash pan, and you'll create a lot more voids for oxygen to let your fire get up to temperature. But chances are you probably just didn't let enough charcoal get lit and there's not enough air in the chamber. The other question we get is, my fire's just burning too hot. Well, it's just the opposite. You've probably let too much charcoal get lit. Keep it to the 2 fistful size chunks and you're probably going to be okay with it. The other thing you can do is make sure your grill is not turned into the wind, because if you have a breeze blowing directly into the intake on the side of your firebox, you're going to get a little bit too much air in there and it's going to catch your charcoal too fast. Another question we get is, my grill is just taking too long to heat up. It's a great question. It's the same kind of thing as the other, where you just need a little bit more oxygen to get that grill going. Get 2 fistful size chunks and you should be fine. If it still takes too long, go crack your lid open for a couple minutes, let some air flow around in there, shut it back down again, and you're going to be at the temperature you need. Fire is very simple. You just need to have the 3 components, and the most important component in a good clean burning fire is having enough air. Sometimes people say the smoke that I'm putting out of my grill is too puffy, it's too white, it seems dirty. We may even see this in pictures or videos online, and people might not even know that they're burning a dirty fire, but they are. The number one key to that, you guessed it, is oxygen. Same thing with the other problems we're having, is you just don't have enough oxygen in that fire. Shake that coal dust out, try to inject some more oxygen by cracking the lid, maybe even doing the turbo method we talked about, but add more oxygen by creating voids in your vents, in your charcoal, in something, so that you get more air into that firebox and you're going to have a lot cleaner burning fire. Sometimes people say my doors are leaking too much smoke. Well, first and foremost, the design of the Hasty-Bake is such that you can actually leak smoke out of your doors and you'll be completely fine. All that means is that the chamber is filled with a good amount of smoke. But it may be that your hood needs to be adjusted. There's some great videos online to go ahead and show you how to adjust your hood. Normally it's as simple as taking a 2x4 and putting it under one side and pushing down on the hood on the other, just to kind of get the metal bent into place. There's also a latch bar on the opposite side that sometimes gets a little bent out of shape. That video will show you how to adjust that too. By having a good square flat sitting hood, you're going to make sure that you're not leaking too much smoke. Some people complain that their burn times are too short. It's just that you need to construct a more complex fire. Reference earlier what we talked about of burning that long burn 12-hour fire. Get some good light charcoal base, add a little bit heavier charcoal, a little bit more on top of that, and build and construct the correct fire, and you'll get a longer burn time. Sometimes you may just not be using enough charcoal. Remember, you can always add more charcoal or use more charcoal in the beginning, as long as you don't get it burning too much. A lot of people say that I put way more charcoal in my grill than they do in theirs. But as long as I don't get that charcoal lit on fire, I don't have to tend it as much, because I've given it more fuel to burn a little bit longer. The last thing I hear from people say a lot is, I'm charring the bottom of my food. Normally what that means is that your fire is directly impacting the bottom of your meat and you need to make some kind of adjustment. That's typically as easy as putting the heat shield directly under the meat. A lot of times what will happen when you're doing a long smoke is someone will build a correct fire, they'll put the heat shield on top of their meat, and then they'll offset their meat from the heat shield. What happens is, as the fire and the heat shoots out from that heat shield, it's shooting directly on top and it hitting the bottom of that meat. What you want to do when you're using the heat shield is move your meat over the top of the heat shield. If you're worried about dripping, you can always put an aluminum pan on top of the heat shield as well to catch that grease so it doesn't line the inside of your grill. But by having that meat on top of your heat shield, you're now allowing that heat to come and circulate the meat, as opposed to just hit the bottom of the meat and create some kind of charred bark on the very bottom. The other thing you can do is simply lower your firebox a little bit lower. Chances are you might have used it in the bake position the last time you cooked and you forgot to just drop it down a little bit lower into the smoke position. By using the heat shield and leveraging how far the fire is away from the meat, you can keep your meat from being charred on the bottom.